So you may have seen the clip. If you haven't, it's worth Googling. A certain Fox faux historian, flummoxed and furious as his fatuous work was being exposed as nothing but fiction, would have you think that tonight's speaker is in fact just, and I quote, a hack. Well, our guest of honor is a distinguished scholar, television commentator, gifted pundit and speaker, astute political historian, and author of the forthcoming bestseller, Killing Bill O'Reilly. It is no surprise to learn that his father was in fact a professor of philosophy, and he himself has numerous degrees. Clearly this man did not want to get out into the real world. He went to Trinity, he went to Oxford, he went to Princeton, he has studied and got degrees in religion, politics, philosophy, and economics. In 1970, there is a letter that is now housed at the Nixon Library from Irving Kristol to the White House, more specifically Daniel Moynihan, who was there then, encouraging Pat to go meet this young man, whom he assured him that he would like tremendously, and describing him, and as I quote, very smart, very nice, a true blue intellectual. He took his PhD in political science at Princeton and there fell under the influence of a disciple of Leo Strauss who converted him to conservatism. Obviously, this was at a time when colleges were not full of snowflakes and conservatives were still allowed. He continued on to work in government and to teach political science. He has innumerable awards. If you look at his Wikipedia page, they go on forever. Many honors and genuine bestsellers. But his most enduring legacy, I think, will be as a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and commentator of just remarkable breadth, insight, salience, and pith. Comedy writers lost a great prospect when our keynoter decided to go in a different direction. I remember one of my favorites was when Bill Clinton proposed that we should hire 100,000 new teachers, and George looked at this and said dryly, maybe we would be better off simply firing 100,000 bad ones. He tackles an extraordinary range of issues in his columns, not least of which is campaign finance reform, most recently, as I recall, calling out the 54 Democratic senators who had the temerity to vote to amend the First Amendment, or pointing out that, and I quote from an article, the limits the reformers had hoped would decrease cynicism about politics is increasing it, which is just another unpleasant surprise for reformers who are repeatedly surprised by their own consequences. George Will, passionate baseball fan, knows that rules matter. He knows that who makes the rules matter. And in politics, while others have been distracted by the vagaries and challenges and clutter of each campaign season, George Will has kept his eye on the umpires and who picks the umpires. George knows that campaign finance laws elect more senators and congressmen than all the great speeches, direct mail, and clever ads could do. He who makes the rules, rules. So I give you our great Lockean defender, dedicated to the condition of liberty, Mr. George Will.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heather, for that overly kind introduction that proves that not all forms of inflation are painful. Heather is in the conservative movement what the Marine Corps is in war. That is a force multiplier to be reckoned with. And we're very glad she's on our side, even if she did reveal tonight the dark secret that I only write about politics to support my baseball habit, which I do share with Senator McConnell. We know that in Washington we do governance pretty much the way the Washington Senators used to do baseball when they were run by a man named Clark Griffith, who said, "The fans like home runs, and we have assembled a pitching staff to please our fans." The Senator mentioned the Buckley-Vallejo. I don't think I've ever told the Senator this. The day the Buckley-Vallejo decision came down, I was at a conference at Ditchley Park in Oxfordshire in England, attended also by Senator Mac Mathias, a liberal Republican from Maryland, who was at that time planning to try an independent run modeled on Gene McCarthy's run for president in 1976. He stood outside the phone booth as I talked to my office in Washington. He said, "What happened?" I told him the Supreme Court decision, and he said, "Well, then I can't run," and he walked away. So the ink was still wet on the Buckley-Vallejo decision, and it had already cost a bit of choice for the American people. I want to talk to you tonight very briefly. I promise I'm standing between you and stronger drink. But very briefly about free speech and campaign finance reform, and I will be brief because after 5,000 columns over 42 years, I think in 750-word chunks. I want to begin with two words. Thank you. Thank you to Brad Smith and to David Keating and to all of you at the center, but most of all to Mitch McConnell. He's a busy man. He could be elsewhere tonight. There's a cruise rally somewhere he could attend. The definition of cognitive dissonance must be Mitch McConnell trying to figure out whether he wants Cruz to win or lose and stay in the Senate. But one of the reasons that Mitch McConnell is the indispensable man in Washington is that he's an institutional man of the Senate and of the legislative branch in an era of spectacular executive overreach. He has never wanted to run for national office, and the National Review once explained why. The National Review said he's going to be a great Senate leader of the Republicans because he really can't run for national office because he has the demeanor of George Will. So I thought it was rather unkind. All of you here who support the center are force multipliers too. This town is planted thick with advocacy groups, most of them advocating policies which would be wrong even if they weren't unconstitutional. This is a different one. You could say really that one man with God is a majority, one man with God and the Institute for Justice is even more powerful. That's theologically problematic, but then so am I. So I want to begin with two more words that really define the condition of free speech in this country. Trigger warning. Have you noticed that trigger warnings need trigger warnings now because the word trigger triggers anxieties about guns, and warning suggests that there's not a safe space nearby. But in fact, we now are experiencing on our campuses what's called sensitivity-based censorship. And I want to draw a little quick picture as to how we got to sensitivity-based censorship and how it really started in this town by people ignoring what Mitch McConnell was warning was coming. I am, as Heather indicated, a lapsed academic. I taught political philosophy before I turned to journalism, or as my father, a professor of philosophy, said, before I sank to journalism. I want to give you just a sense of what's going on our campuses. At Brown University recently, they invited a woman who was skeptical of the dubious social science on which they have based the idea of a pandemic rape culture. It's very curious. Today, the argument is that our campuses are hotbeds of sexual assault and racism, and everyone is entitled to go there free. I don't understand Well, Brown University had invited this woman, and then there was, of course, a furor erupted, and Brown made a Solomonic decision. They said, we will not disinvite the speaker. She can still come, but we will provide a safe space for those traumatized by the very idea that someone of this ilk would be on their campus. The safe space would include, and I'm not making a bit of this up, cookies, coloring books, Play-Doh, calming music, pillows, blankets, videos of frolicking puppies, and people trained in trauma, which means Brown is the most expensive daycare facility on America. The question is, where did students get the idea that the First Amendment is optional, that the First Amendment is a mere recommendation, that the First Amendment is unimportant, that the clarity of the First Amendment is really fraught with ambiguities? I want to lapse to explain how we got from there, from here to there, and really from McCain-Feingold to there, by becoming professorial for a moment and giving a very quick tour of recent cultural history. I could begin in the 19th century, but I'll spare you that. We get many good cars from Germany today. In the 19th century, we've got a number of very bad ideas, one of which was the idea of false consciousness, the idea that the masses are given a false consciousness by the social arrangements and social promptings that shape them willy-nilly, and that therefore there needs to be a vanguard fine-tuning the social promptings lest people get the wrong ideas. Leave that aside. But do begin in the 1950s when the world and I were young. The 1950s was the era of Mad Men, of Madison Avenue. We became, in one decade, in an explosion of new technology, we became a wired nation. The whole nation sat down and watched I Love Lucy and Howdy Doody and became transfixed by television, both as an entertainment and a marketing mechanism. By the second half of the 1950s, there was high anxiety about this new medium. In 1957, Vance Packard published a book called The Hidden Persuaders, in which he said, television, perhaps flashing subliminal messages, was manipulating the American people beyond their powers to resist. In 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith published, in a way, the iconic liberal manifesto of the second half of the 20th century, The Affluent Society, in which he said, the power of advertising is so great now that the law of supply and demand is obviated because manufacturers can now manufacture a demand for whatever they find it convenient to produce. This meant that consumer sovereignty was a fiction. This meant that the bovine masses were subject to the powers of television. This was an unfortunate year to publish that because as he was publishing this book about how manufacturers could manufacture a desire for anything they produced, the Ford Motor Company produced at exactly that time the Edsel. But Galbraith was never one to be deterred by evidence or its lack. In 1959, the final year of that decade, Richard Condon, a novelist, produced the novel Manchurian Candidate, which brought together all the paranoia about the manipulability of the American people and of people in general. The story, of course, about a POW brainwashed by the sinister North Koreans, a very 1950s anxiety. Well, at the end of this, we had to understand that there was no need, if these people were right, to respect the mind of the American electorate or the sovereignty of the American consumer. It was not then just permissible, it was obligatory to regulate the impulses and the speech that people would hear. It was not long after that that McCain-Feingold was germinated in the minds of Mr. McCain and Mr. Feingold, becoming the worst law passed in my 46 years in Washington. While this is going on in Washington, the peculiar kind of approach to free speech was also germinating on campuses, where the new freedom today, of course, is freedom from speech. For 40 years now, all the jurisprudential thinking in the law schools and in the law journals about the First Amendment has been increasingly ingenious arguments for balancing the First Amendment against other competing and often superior values. Let me give you just one example. In the 1980s, a Stanford law professor produced a law review article of 31 pages, 62 footnotes, and one almost sublimely weird idea. The idea was that Brown v. Board of Education makes obligatory the censorship of speech because the Brown v. Board of Education said it is unconstitutional to have stigmas and badges of inferiority, and speech can be a badge of inferiority, and therefore any message of inferiority should, under the doctrine of Brown v. Board of Education, be permissible fodder for censorship. That's just one sign, and I could multiply the list indefinitely, of why speech in this country has never been more comprehensively, aggressively, and dangerously assaulted. The Alien and Sedition Acts arose from the furies of our beginning to evolve a party system. They were sunsetted and they disappeared when the furies burnt themselves out. The attacks on free speech under Woodrow Wilson around the First World War similarly were the product of a passing fever, as were these attacks on free speech after the Second World War. What is new, what is different has been referred to tonight, and that is 54 Democrats, including the two poseurs who are independents, the 54 Democrats who have voted to amend the Bill of Rights, amend the First Amendment, to make it less protective of our freedoms. I think they have gone too far, but I think that's good. There comes a time when worse is better. And the fact that the American people are not yet fully apprised of this, but will be fully apprised of what they have done, is going to be very helpful. Now, we hear it said again and again and again. All we care about, say the speech regulators, is that there's too much money in politics. They say, my God, this year, in this presidential cycle, perhaps $3 billion will be spent. If so, we will spend in this 2-year presidential cycle about half of what the American people spent in October on Halloween decorations, candies, and costumes. Anyone looking at our political system as an economist is staggered by how little we spend to elect the people who make the decisions that determine the spending of trillions of dollars. It's an enormously important, it is an enormously important time for us because the actuarial course of the Supreme Court is ominous for its members. The next president may well have not 1, 2, or 3, but 4 Supreme Court nominations to make. That could just be in the first term. But I am not in despair about this. Pessimism has its pleasures. Pessimists are right most of the time, and they're delighted when they're wrong, which is why I subscribe to the Ohio in 1895 theory of history, so named by me for the little-known fact that in Ohio in 1895 there were just 2 automobiles, and they collided. That is a variant of the buttered side down law, which is that the chance of the bread falling buttered side down is proportional to the cost of the carpet. Looking around the world and around the multiplying and multiform attacks on the First Amendment, it is tempting to feel the way Earl Weaver felt when he was the manager of the Baltimore Orioles and was the scourge of American League umpires. He was a short, irascible, dyspeptic, Napoleonic little figure who, by the third inning, was out of sorts and became the scourge of the umpires. And he'd come barreling out of the dugout, stick his chin into the chest of a much larger umpire, and at the top of his lungs he'd shout, "Are you going to get any better, or is this it?" Things are getting better, believe it or not. They're getting better, I think, because We have now, as in this room represented, we have a firm, philosophically based coalition that knows the vocabulary, that knows how to make the arguments, and that knows it speaks the language of American natural rights, which is the almost infallible opponent of American progressivism. One last word about Woodrow Wilson. I have offered to come to Princeton and teach pro bono, a class to the African American students there to teach them how to really dislike Woodrow Wilson. It is my contention that the most important decision made in the 20th century was the decision where to locate the Princeton Graduate School. Woodrow Wilson, then president of Princeton University, wanted the graduate school located down in the main campus. His nemesis, Dean Andrew Fleming West, wanted it where it is, up on a hill about a 15-minute walk from the main campus. When Woodrow Wilson lost, he had one of his characteristic temper tantrums, resigned the presidency of Princeton, went into politics, and ruined the 20th century. I simplify somewhat and exaggerate a bit, but the point is that what you are doing, you are defending at bottom the natural rights tradition. You are defending the first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. You are defending those paragraphs that Woodrow Wilson said, literally said, do not read them. He said we must outgrow those, we must have an organic living constitution, and we must understand that the first two paragraphs of the Declaration are 4th of July sentiments. Well, we're doing better. As I say, look around you, look at the people sitting next to you. This is a winning coalition in this room. We can't, however, rest on our laurels. We can't just keep saying, so far, so good. So far, so good. It reminds me, if you'll forgive me, of a baseball story. Everything does. True story. 1951, Warren Spahn, on the way to becoming the winningest left-handed pitcher in the history of baseball, was pitching for the then Boston Braves against the then New York Giants in the then Polo Grounds. And the Giants sent up to the plate a rookie who was 0 for 13. It was clear the kid would never hit big league pitching. It was a kid named Willie Mays. Spahn stood out on the mound 66 inches from home plate, fired the ball, and Mays crushed it. First hit, first home run. After the game, the sports writers went up to Spahn in the clubhouse and said, "Spahny, what happened?" Spahn said, "Gentlemen, for the first 60 feet, that was a hell of a pitch." Not good enough in baseball, not good enough in the defense of the First Amendment. So far, so good, because we have been winning, as David and Brad have indicated. But we can't keep winning unless we stay on offense, and that's why we're here tonight to support this center. This center has become the gold standard of public advocacy in defense of the most important provision of the Constitution. Now, Aristotle said, the most important of all the virtues is courage, because without it, none of the other virtues are availing. The First Amendment is the most important provision because when that is lost, everything is lost. And that is why it is so important to understand that this center has become the standard by which advocacy groups are judged in this town. Which reminds me, I promise I'll stop this, it reminds me of one more pertinent baseball story. Rogers Hornsby, the greatest right-handed hitter in the history of baseball, was at the plate, and there was a rookie pitcher on the mound who was quite understandably petrified. And the rookie threw 3 pitches that he thought were right on the edge of the plate, but the umpire said, ball 1, ball 2, ball 3. The rookie got flustered, took off and shouted in at the umpire, said, "Umpire, those were strikes." The umpire took off his mask, looked out at the pitcher, and said, "Young man, when you throw a strike, Mr. Hornsby will let you know." Hornsby had become the standard. If you didn't swing, it wasn't a strike. And that's the sense in which this center is the standard by which good arguments and ferocious defense of freedom are judged. So I thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I thank you most of all for supporting this center, because when you do, you're supporting all of our livelihoods. I've talked too long. I'm terribly sorry, but you're probably feeling the way Jeff Torborg did when he was managing the White Sox. He went out one day to take a pitcher out of the mound, a pitcher named Jimmy Kern. He got to the mound, and Kern said, "Skipper, I'm not tired." Torborg said, "Jimmy, we know you're not tired, but our outfielders are." So on that note, I shall subside. I thank you again for letting me be part of this, and I wish you Godspeed and good luck.